latitude, prevailing winds and ocean currents, mountains and the nearness to the sea. Things like that determine what we call the climate, determine what the climate of a place will be.
Welcome to Cambridge Zero Climate Talks with Antoinette Nestor
and Amy Munro-Ford.
Well, Amy's taking a well-deserved break this week, so I'm on my own. Regardless, this week I had a wonderful and invigorating week talking about different sustainability issues. I spoke to Jonathan Hughes, the Chief Executive Officer at the United Nations Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Center, Alexei Lapkin, Professor of Sustainable Reaction Engineering at the Department of Chemical Engineering and Biotechnology at the University of Cambridge, and I also spoke to Sara Steele, Museum Learning Assistant at the University Museum of Zoology. So first of all, here is Jonathan Hughes, the Chief Executive Officer of WCMC. Johnny, thank you very much for joining us today. And for our audience, would you mind telling us your full name and what you do, please?
So my full name is Jonathan Hughes, and I'm the CEO of WCMC, which works in collaboration with the United Nations Environment Programme as UNEP-WCMC here in Cambridge. I'm generally known as Johnny to my friends and my colleagues, though.
And can you tell us what WCMC stands for and what its mission is?
So WCMC stands for the World Conservation Monitoring Center. And as I mentioned, it works in collaboration with the United Nations Environment Programme. And we work in a unique collaboration as UNEP-WCMC, as we're generally known amongst our colleagues and clients across the world. We really work at the interface of science and data and information and policy. So we're trying to get data and knowledge and science packaged up and into the hands of decision makers across the world so they can make better decisions about the natural environment and about the future of our planet. So we very much work in the kind of information system space, and we're about really trying to create system change in order to make that transition towards a more sustainable world.
And how has the pandemic affected your work, and how do you see WCMC emerging out of the current pandemic?
In terms of how it's affected our provision of data, science, knowledge to the global community, we are thinking about how we can respond to the pandemic and how we might help in shaping a new world that can respond to this crisis that we're facing at the moment, but particularly how that ties in with the two other crises which are facing us that we need to tackle in the next decade, which is climate change and the biodiversity crisis. So how do these three crises fit together: the pandemic, the climate change crisis, the biodiversity crisis? And how, if you like, can we respond to them in a coherent way? So one of the things that we do at UNEP-WCMC is we maintain and analyze global patterns of trade in wildlife. These, as you may have read in the press, are thought to be a contributing factor to zoonotic disease outbreaks, and the coronavirus outbreak is no different. So that's one area of work, obviously, that we will continue to work on and potentially put a little bit more investment into in the coming months and years. We also collaborate with a large network of researchers on wild meat and its consumption as food in Africa and Southeast Asia. And we also think that that's a key link in the chain of potential zoonotic transmission. So that there's another area of work there where we can bring some expertise and we can continue to provide insights into the connections there between wild meat consumption and the emergence of zoonotic diseases. We lead on the development of data sets in global biodiversity patterns and trends, including for species that may act as vectors for the coronavirus and indeed other viral groups. And of course, more broadly, we work with countries and we work with businesses and we work with finance institutions and we work with NGOs all across the world, providing advice on nature-based solutions to both the climate crisis, but also to solve societal objectives. And this is all kind of related to resilience within landscapes and resilience within both human systems and ecosystems. So in some ways, the response to the pandemic is it's another side of the other side of the kind of coin to the biodiversity crisis. It's like, I really think as as we restore, protect, and sustainably use ecosystems, and we move towards a more sustainable models of management of those ecosystems, we will build that resilience and hopefully break the opportunity or break the chain of opportunity that viruses might emerge from the natural environment.
And you mentioned nature-based solutions. What do you mean by nature-based solutions? I mean, it's a word, that phrase that we've heard before, but for people to understand where you're coming from, can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think for a long time, nature was seen as the problem, a problem to be fixed, an expensive problem to be fixed. We damage nature, then we need to spend, an awful lot of money on restoring it and bringing it back. I think that thinking is beginning to change. We're now beginning to see nature as a solution to many of the societal problems that we face, not least climate change. But as I've just mentioned, there's connections there with disease control potentially as well. So this concept of nature-based solutions has really emerged over the last 20 years or so, but particularly in the last decade, culminating actually just last week in the announcement by the IUCN of a new global standard for nature-based solutions, which for the first time really defines what a nature-based solution is, and how they can be deployed across the world to deliver on a range of different societal, environmental, and economic goals. So the idea behind a nature-based solution is that you use natural infrastructure, you use nature to tackle a particular societal problem. So if we take climate change, for example, we know that the restoration of ecosystems globally can contribute a third or more of the climate mitigation effort that we need to stay within anything like a stable climate. So nature is a powerful ally there. If we can turn what is effectively now a degraded asset, which is the degraded ecosystems around the world, into something which is an asset for the future, we could begin to tackle a climate crisis, but also at the same time deliver a range of other benefits that come from healthy ecosystems: clean water, clean air, great places to live and work, a secure supply of food, stability when it comes to, and resilience when it comes to the emergence of diseases. So these are all examples of where if you work with nature rather than degrading nature, you can deliver a whole range of different societal benefits. And this is why I think the IUCN guidance that came out last week, the standard, is so important, because it sets some boundaries and definitions as to what nature-based solutions are. And probably the most important thing is that they have to deliver for nature as well as for people. A nature-based solution cannot really be called a nature-based solution if you destroy nature in the process. And I would also add, it's not all about climate change as well. Natural climate solutions, which are in some ways a subset of nature-based solutions, are one example of a nature-based solution. But there could be nature-based solutions, for example, from the restoration of habitats in upland catchments to prevent the severity of flooding in cities in the lower catchment, which is nothing to do with carbon, but it is a nature-based solution, because what it's doing, it's protecting the citizens of that town from potentially severe flooding events, using the restoration of nature as a method to do that, often in combination with harder engineering solutions such as flood defenses. The two things can go together. Nature-based solutions can be co-designed with more traditional kind of grey infrastructure interventions to solve problems.
So, Johnny, in an ideal world, what would you like to see in relation, for example, to climate change or the environment or other issue that's important to you?
I think one of the biggest issues for climate change and biodiversity, and not just biodiversity actually, but the other components of natural capital. So the natural capital are the stocks of natural ecosystems globally. So they include the non-living components of ecosystems as well, which is the soil, the water, the air that we breathe. So I think it's very important to think about the environment in terms of all those aspects of natural capital. Obviously, with biodiversity being probably the most important component of that. I think the biggest challenge really is to urgently shift away from land use practices, and indeed practices in the oceans as well, which are currently leading to a loss of nature and a loss of carbon from our from our ecosystems towards land use systems, and I'm thinking particularly about agriculture here, which are creating conditions where biodiversity can thrive and carbon can be locked away in natural ecosystems. And we really need to make this transition within 10 years, really, if we're going to have any chance of staying within the 2 degrees warming, which is modeled, and even that's already too much. So I'd very much like to see UNEP-WCMC provide that thought leadership and the science to enable that rapid, and it has to be systematic as well, that systematic shift away from land uses, which are currently generating carbon emissions and harming nature, to systems which restore nature, and as I mentioned earlier, could provide over a third of the climate change mitigation effort that's needed to stay within anything like 2 degrees. So to do that, we need to do things like provide effective protection and management of primary forests and habitats like peatlands, which store colossal amounts of carbon, but also other important nature-rich habitats. And we can do that through things like systems of protected areas and other effectively conserved and managed areas. We can do that through encouraging and working with indigenous peoples and communities across the world who together actually manage a huge percentage of the most important biodiversity hotspots on the planet. We can do that through restoring degraded marginal lands back to nature, which are actually no longer being used for agriculture in some cases, but also shifting away from intensive agriculture and transforming intensive agricultural systems into more nature positive, carbon capturing agricultural systems. So this idea of regenerative agriculture, I think, is a really powerful one. The idea that, you're not degrading your stocks of natural capital year on year through your farming activities, but you're nurturing those and you're enhancing those, but at the same time you're producing commodities and food which are so important to humanity. How can we move to a system which is truly regenerative, and also say something about cities as well, because cities is very much part of this transition towards sustainable land use as well. Because greening our cities, I think this is really a design challenge as much as anything in cities. But greening our cities, using nature-based solutions and coming up with great innovations of, for example, rooftop and vertical agriculture, or the depave movement, I think is really interesting. So getting rid of concrete and tarmac, which has been poured in cities for very carelessly and sometimes needlessly, and re-exposing the soils and bringing back cities, bringing back those soils to life, and allowing them to provide benefits such as drainage and allowing the city to breathe again, if you like, and bringing back nature in that way to give people a better quality of life within our cities. I think there's a whole agenda there which is incredibly important. Sometimes we forget actually that most of us now live in cities. We are an urban animal for the first time in human history. So it's vital, I think, to bring back nature to the city in any way we can, and thinking about how we design that and how we innovate to do that, I think is really important.
So do you feel that we should speak more about the natural capital, that it should be part of our vocabulary?
Yeah. I think the language really depends in some ways on the audience. The interesting thing about the term natural capital is it really resonates with certain audiences. So if you're speaking to a business audience about the need to look after nature, some of them might be motivated, and some of them might respond and think, okay, yeah, we have a moral obligation to protect nature. But if you talk about natural capital and the fact that actually all financial capital is derived from natural capital, and actually what you're doing as a business, if you're undermining those natural capital stocks, all you're doing is actually you're not creating value. You're just destroying value in one place to create lesser value in another place through destroying natural capital to create financial capital. And if you talk about value creation in natural capital and assets and looking after assets, that is the language that business can understand, and not just understand, actually then put in place put in place policies that they can actually do something about it, so they can try and understand their supply chains. They can try and understand where their raw materials are coming from, and whether those raw materials are coming from ecosystems which are being degraded, or they're coming from regenerative ecosystems. And if they're not coming from regenerative ecosystems, then perhaps put some pressure on their suppliers to say, look, we want you to manage this land differently, in such a way that the soils are not being destroyed. So, if for example if it's a supply of meat from a particular animal, what we're seeing around the world is chronic overgrazing is one of the drivers of biodiversity loss, not just in recently deforested systems, which I think we all know that parts of tropical rainforests across the world are being chopped down and then grazed. But actually, this has been a problem for centuries. This is not a recent problem. Chronic overgrazing is one of the big drivers of biodiversity loss. Can businesses who are in the agricultural commodity sector, can they begin to put a little bit of pressure on their supply chains to say, look, we want you to adopt grazing regimes which are taking pressure off the landscape, and it might mean a lower yield, but it also might mean that the landscape then recovers, the soils recover, the carbon comes back in those ecosystems, the biodiversity begins to recover. And I think that's one of the challenges of regenerative agriculture, is making sure that we have enough production globally, but at the same time we're taking pressure off ecosystems and allowing them to recover. And one of the things, of course, driving a non-regenerative farming model at the moment is the subsidies which are going into agriculture. So 2 billion a day in agricultural subsidies are pumped into what is frankly an unsustainable farming system globally. So that's perpetuating this agriculture which is ravaging ecosystems and soils and creating carbon emissions and destroying biodiversity. So if we could shift that 2 billion of subsidies that goes into farming support every day towards paying for regenerative agriculture, which actually provides a whole range of other different societal benefits, coming back to the nature-based solutions idea, then we could actually, I think, very quickly start to shift back into a more balanced relationship with nature and with agriculture.
And now that you mentioned agriculture and regenerative agriculture and the issues of the cows in Midsummer comes to mind, do you think that perhaps having more grazing areas in cities, which sometimes people when they visit Cambridge they find it fascinating that you have cows right next to very urban areas. Do you think that's a good idea, or is it something that's just unique to Cambridge?
No, it's great to see the cows in Cambridge. Actually, I try and get out for a walk at least once a day, walk and talk. Certainly, if I'm having a one-to-one with my staff, I try and get out and have a wander over Midsummer Common, and it is that connection to have animals in the middle of the city like that is great, and love Lammas land down in the floodplain of the old floodplain of the Cam. There is something kind of quite nurturing and calming about having these animals in the middle of the city. It comes back to my point about the greening of cities. Really, if we can try and bring nature onto people's doorsteps, not just in their gardens, but actually in the public realm, outside their houses, in the public green spaces across the world. And I think, the research shows that people's blood pressure goes down, their heart rate calms, they breathe more slowly when they are in a more natural environment. So this is a health issue. It's a health and well-being issue as much as anything. Psychologically and physically, nature has very beneficial effects, particularly in that harsh urban environments, which can actually be naturally very stressful for people.
What about the green recovery? How do you feel, or how do you see the green recovery taking shape within your area of work?
So there's a lot of talk about the green recovery at the moment, and there's lots of big figures flying around suggesting that possibly up to 20 trillion is going to be pumped into the economy as a kind of fiscal stimulus, a green fiscal stimulus. Yeah, and of course everybody's hoping for a green recovery. At least, you know, I think most of the people listening to this radio program will be hoping for a green recovery. But the signs actually are not as promising as maybe the media are sometimes making out. So there was a study by a company called Vivid Economics in June that looked at stimulus packages around the world. And it only looked at a fraction of them. So it looked at, well, I say a fraction, it's still a huge amount of money, 3.5 trillion of environmentally relevant funds across 17 major economies. And of the ones it looked at, only 3 actually were assessed as having net benefits for climate change, biodiversity, and other environmental impacts. So this is 3.5 trillion of environmentally linked funds, which are not actually going to deliver benefits for climate change, biodiversity, environmental impacts. Now that's really worrying, because that's an awful lot of money that could be doing good. Strangely enough, the UK was one of those which whose package was going to have a benefit for climate change and biodiversity. So that's quite reassuring. And the European Union was the front runner with its green recovery package. So that to me is slightly concerning. But we also know on the flip side of this that if governments embraced the idea of a green recovery and made that investment, the benefits could be substantial. So tackling the global nature crisis, according to the World Economic Forum, could create 400 million jobs and $10 trillion in business value each year by 2030. So that, to me, is an economic imperative. Never mind the kind of environmental and the societal imperative. There's an economic imperative there to put the money into the into a green recovery. So what does that green recovery look like? Well, we've touched upon some of these things already, but I've mentioned cutting food waste. So one of the ways to do that is to provide metal silos and crates to keep food from rotting. Very, very simple investments that can be made, which could rapidly reduce food waste, but are not being made at the moment because there's a lack of capital available to the farmers and the processors that want to make those investments. Simply the better management of our fisheries could boost catches of fish and add 40 million jobs and 170 billion in value in the next 10 years. And that's just fisheries alone. That's a good example of actually where the degradation of natural capital stocks has actually had a profoundly negative economic consequence as well as an ecological consequence. And then, of course, I've mentioned the subsidies to agriculture. No, they're all examples, but of course, investment in cycling and walking infrastructure. The UK government have committed to an investment in cycle and walking infrastructure. And then the retrofitting of buildings, energy efficiency measures. There's a whole range of non-nature-based solutions, if you like, which can also help us in our transition to a low-carbon economy. These are all things which are, to me, sound like a total no-brainer. These are things. If we're going to invest in something, why don't we invest in something that creates jobs, creates green-collar jobs, is great for the economy, and delivers on a range of different sustainable development goals. So now's the opportunity to do that. We're at a crossroads with the pandemic where we have the opportunity here to do things differently. But then again, we said that in 2008. Some people said that in 2008 when we had the financial crisis in 2008. And there was some talk about green recovery for a few months, and then it was soon back to business as usual. I honestly don't think business as usual is an option this time, and we need to shift towards an inclusive green economy, and we need to do that very quickly. Otherwise, the consequences economically will be profoundly negative, I should say.
So, Johnny, thank you very much.
Cheers, bye-bye.
If you just joined us, this is Cambridge Zero Climate Talks. It's very interesting, actually, what Johnny had to say in relation to sustainability. So it relates rather well with the conversation I had with Sara Steele. So have a listen. Sara, thank you very much for joining us today. And for the people listening to us today, would you mind telling them your full name and what you do, please?
Yes, thank you for having me. My name is Sara Steele. I am the Museum Learning Assistant at the Museum of Zoology. So that basically encompasses anything to do with the general public, as well as other audiences. So we're a very small team of 2 in the public engagement team. So we do anything from teaching school groups that are visiting to running community programs, working with community partners and creating trails and all of the fun stuff for general visitors as well. So it's a very busy role.
Now, and on the current situation, of course, you have to shut everything down. So tell us a little bit about the current virtual offers that you have at the museum.
Yeah, so once everything went into lockdown, we moved our offer online. Especially with the museum having to close. So trying to get our activities as well as any sort of opportunity to engage with the collection onto a new digital space. So that's called the Museum of Zoology blog. And that can be found through a Google search or through our social medias platforms as well. And yeah, really to just use the opportunity that we've been given to create new resources that can be accessed from anywhere in the world, really. It's a really unique opportunity to be able to spend time doing that, because usually we're seeing people face to face and are very busy in the museum spaces. But yes, everyone being sent home was a very unique opportunity.
And now moving on, how do you see the role of the Museum of Zoology in particular, but perhaps of all museums, in how we approach climate change and issues in relation to the environment?
So we're in a very unique position for museums, anyway, for the sector, in that we are embedded within the Department of Zoology as part of the University of Cambridge. And we are also within the same building as the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. So that is a building that houses various different conservation charities and foundations and things within that same building. And because of that, we work very closely with the department and with Cambridge Conservation Initiative, so we'll abbreviate that to CCI. And that can be on anything from the resources that we put out to events that we host, and that includes our hosting digital events now as well. And we've recently done our annual Zoology Live festival online, which is usually something that we hold in the museum. It's a really lovely big weekend long activity, but yes, we did a week-long digital event this year. If anyone did miss our Zoology Live festival, actually, because it was digital this year, they can catch it on YouTube, still on our YouTube channel. Yes, that's another advantage of going online, is everything then goes up there and people can come and see it whenever they like. As a museum, for us, we're incredibly dedicated to our own sort of sustainability and how we impact the environment around us. So it did right down to how we design our activities. So family activities, for example, craft activities, usually traditionally use a lot of single-use plastic or non-recyclable materials. So what we've started doing there as of reopening in 2018 is to ensure that we're actually using either recyclable or biodegradable, sustainable materials, because not everything ends up on the fridge door or framed or anything like that. Just considering our impact on our environment, as well as being able to talk about all of the wildlife conservation that's going on with the researchers and scientists in the building that we share with them. I think museums are incredibly important, mostly for communicating the work that's going on. We are basically that stage that the conservation and the department can use the public engagement trained, communication trained colleagues of theirs to help them to promote what they're doing and to share what they're doing with the public, so that there's more understanding around why we are researching these various different aspects of conservation or the natural world. So yeah, we're almost that bridge between the science and everyone else as well, which is a really useful tool for not only the department but CCI, as well as anywhere else that a natural history museum might sit. The majority of natural history museums do have links with research departments, but not all natural history collections do. So you do have some sort of small museums that will have a little bit of everything, a little bit of every type of collection. And they have a lot of links with their local communities because they tend to be smaller museums, definitely more locally linked museums. And they can also provide this stage for telling those stories to the public. So I think I'm slightly biased because I do have a background in working in museums, but as opposed to a science background. But I think that museums do play a very important role in communicating all of the science to the public.
Indeed, I mean, you have a wonderful collection of specimens that Darwin collected on his voyage, which is we're very, very fortunate to have them here in Cambridge. And so do you actually see the role of museums changing, and especially now that everything has gone digital, do you actually see it much more of a role in teaching children and adults what happens with the environment, for example, animals that have gone extinct? How do you see that sort of developing, or do you think it's much more important nowadays than it was before?
So I don't necessarily see the role itself changing. It's just how we do it is changing. So we're using different resources. We're taking those resources online and trying to reach larger audiences as well. It's simply because the internet is wonderful for that, and it means that we can get to audiences that are not so easily able to get to the physical museum, and we can share our collections to a much wider group of people. The premise behind it, I think, would still be there. We're still sharing the same research stories and the same need to protect our wildlife and information around the species that are endangered or going extinct. And a lot of even that would be linked to the researchers within the department and the foundations and charities within CCI. We're just highlighting their stories in a different way. So that's something that's actually on our blog under research stories. So that's a collection of scientists and researchers who are just saying a little bit about what they do. And we did initially have that as a physical trail around the museum, but we've made that digital with the museum needing to be closed as well. So that's our most recent one would have been our International Women's Day trail. So that's female identifying researchers and scientists who work locally within the university and CCI, just saying a little bit about what they do and providing that link with the species in the museum.
And do you think that those experiences will actually change or are changing in light of the current climate change conditions? For example, the other day we saw on the news that the polar bears may go extinct because of the melting sea ice. So do you think that in that regard, museums should be doing much more or are just doing enough?
I think that we can share the science and we can share the information that we do have. The difficulty is getting those resources, especially online, with there being so much out there, to audiences. And we can use our different platforms to share and promote our resources, especially as they are founded in science and in current research. The choice as to whether anyone interacts with it or reads it is, again, difficult because we do have the entire internet to contend with. But I believe that museums have a responsibility almost to be that bridge between the science and the communities, because we can communicate in a way that is relatable. And yes, we should use our powers for good.
I like that, using the power for good. And now, if you had sort of this other extra power that you could see into the future, what would you like to see?
Much more green spaces. I absolutely love nature and wildlife, and also believe that it does amazing things for human well-being as well. Us interacting with nature is really good for us, and seeing more green spaces, creating spaces where wildlife can live alongside us and with us as well, is only going to be a good thing. And a lot of what we've been creating over the summer on our blog page is promoting people going out and looking at their local wildlife, seeing what they can find, maybe taking note of whether there has been a change with people going in and out of lockdown, with there being more or less people moving around the environment. Even down to our craft activities that we are starting to create more of for the upcoming summer holidays as well. We'll be promoting people going out and seeing if they can actually see these animals that they've created in their local environment. So lots of mini beasts, because they are, yes, an easy thing to find in nature. But also birds as well. And a lot of our campaigns that we had over the Zoology Live Festival were encouraging people to go out and interact with their local wildlife. So yes, I would like to see more spaces where people can do that, whether that's within cities or outside of cities, or anywhere that we can get to, really. We've got quite a few different architectural aspects to the Museum of Zoology. One is a slate wall that has gaps within the slate, and behind that are lots of different crevices, often made by discarded snail shells. And that's somewhere where little invertebrates and solitary bees or spiders can actually create a home within. That was something done by Ackroyd and Harvey when we were closed the first time. And we've also got a green roof as well. So there's wildflowers and things up there for insects in the centre of the city. So just more spaces like that, really, that really help.
I didn't realise about the green roof. That's actually very
so it's not open to the public. Because it's literally just on the top of the building, but it goes right across to on the CCI side of the David Attenborough building as well, and just hopefully giving a bit of a refuge for bees and butterflies and moths and other insects and birds and things within the city centre.
Oh, that's fantastic. Actually, maybe we should try to push for more green roofs. That would be great. If we have more wildflowers in the green spaces.
Imagine seeing a city from above and not being able to see any buildings because they all have green roofs. I think it would be amazing.
It would actually. Maybe that's the perfect wish for the future. And Sara, is there anything else that I have forgotten to ask you?
Only that if people do want to continue to get involved with the museum, obviously have a look at the blog that we've produced and our social media channels, but we also have 2 zoology clubs. They are free, and everything about them is free of charge. One is the Young Zoologist Club, which is for ages 6 to 12, and then the Zoology Club is ages 13 to 18, and they get free newsletters via email, as well as workshops when we're able, and lots of opportunities given to them with the museum and with various different activities to do with conservation and the natural world. They can be signed up to on our website as well as the blog as well. So if people do want to get their kids involved, or if teens want to get involved, then those are good ones to join. We've also got a mailing list for adults as well to keep in touch with the events that we're putting on, both digital and in person.
So, Sara, thank you very much. It has been wonderful to have you on.
Thank you.
You're listening to Cambridge Zero Climate Talks. And the final guest for today is Professor Alexei Latkin, and he is from the Department of Chemical Engineering and Biotechnology. And we had a really insightful conversation about machine learning and AI when it comes to chemistry. Alexei, thank you very much for joining us today. In relation to your work, how does your work in machine learning and robotics addresses the issues of sustainability in chemistry?
Chemistry is one of the most important industries and sciences in technological society. Everything around us is chemistry. And innovations in chemistry, innovations in materials is the cornerstone of pretty much every innovation which you see around in everything, in mobile phones, in communications, in computing, in healthcare and so on. It's all chemistry. However, chemical synthesis is still dependent on non-renewable materials and non-renewable energy sources, and quite often uses toxic ingredients and has chemical manufacturing has issues with the waste. And this is all dependent on how the reactions are designed, how the processes are developed. And the industry seemed to have been quite slow in adapting to the possibilities of the digitalization when everything is traced and could be optimized much more efficiently. And there are some genuine reasons why this is the case. However, over the last few years, there is a revolution ongoing in chemistry with the attempts to digitize the entire research and development and manufacturing workflows to increase the efficiencies radically, reduce the energy use, reduce the materials use, and particularly reduce the toxicity and the emissions. And this is extremely encouraging for sustainability. But the other aspect of this is that sustainability is a genuine complex systems problem, which is not reducible to standard problems which we normally address with classical research methods. This is not possible for sustainability. In order to solve sustainability problems, one has to use the machinery of complex science, and much of it is machine learning and artificial intelligence.
So how do you see your area of work expanding at the moment with the pandemic and everything happening? Do you see it is actually much more relevant, or has it been sidetracked?
No, I think our work is indeed very relevant today because we work on scientific experiments which could be done by machines with people remotely. We work on methods of research which are data-driven, which allow people to work remotely. We work in very close collaboration with people in different countries and different time zones. So effectively, our research projects almost never sleep because people pick them up and work together in different time zones. And this is the nature of the future research and future collaboration. When knowledge is shared, facilities are shared, and we're much less dependent on the individual capabilities of a particular place, a particular group. It's much more shared and collaborative. This is facilitated by digitalization because the information is accessible by tools and easily shared. And that's the COVID basically highlighted that is absolutely necessary.
And looking a bit into the future, what would you like to see in the future, perhaps within your own area of work, or perhaps in a larger scale within the world? What would you like to see?
I think the next priority for us would be to improve our understanding of what the sustainable society is, or maybe, or what are the paths to a sustainable society, because we're getting better at understanding the technological changes and putting the infrastructure to solve them. I think digitalization of chemistry will happen. We will solve many of the problems which even a few years ago we couldn't even dream of solving. This is going to happen, but this is not the problem of sustainability. The problem of sustainability, the next steps will be not in my domains, unfortunately. They are in the domains of the structure of the economy, the sort of societal integration, global access to education, and so on. This is where the challenges of sustainability are. If there is poverty, if there is inequality, if the economic system is promoting the inequality and further bad practices by corporations and by society, then there is no chance. And at the moment, there is not that much focus on these very difficult problems. We're focusing on the restarting the economy and the growth, but many people understand that if growth forever is not possible. You have to change what this means. But I don't see much work on the vision of what the future economic system should look like, what future jobs should look like. How do you reward people without promoting greed and consumerism? How do you stop consumerism, which is driving the loss of habitat and loss of resources? We consume so much unnecessary stuff, which is completely, totally unnecessary for happiness or for well-being, but it's being promoted deliberately to drive the economy. And this is wrong. There are many, many things which are wrong at the moment. And so we can reduce the impact of manufacturing of all of this stuff, but this stuff is also unnecessary. So the easiest way to solve the problem is just not make it. But then it impacts on the economy, on the jobs, and so on. So this is where you see that this is a really complex systems problem and everything is interconnected. So this is also the challenge for me when I teach sustainability, is to show this interconnectedness between the domains of knowledge to the students so that they understand how to try to start thinking about these challenges and problems.
That brings me to the questions. Well, how do you see the green recovery? Now there's a big focus on green recovery, and this is what it must be done, and we have to focus on the green recovery. But then if everything is connected, how do you actually put what you do within a green recovery framework?
This is, again, the difficulty of complex systems. You don't know what the right answer is, and there isn't a right answer. In practice, the mathematicians know this. So if you have these types of problems, we use so-called evolutionary algorithms to optimize complex systems, which means that you try many times and quite often you fail. And nature does exactly the same. So there will be paths which are incorrect, and there will be corrective actions. And this is what we need to do. But we need to do something, and we need to do many things in parallel. Certainly green recovery, the aim to create new types of jobs, new types of industries related to greener energy and so on, are incredibly useful. But what is necessary is every time we think about the action is to think about consequences which are remote. Try to build networks of effects, try to understand what are the possible consequences and build scenarios. So this analysis of potential scenarios of actions are really, really important. And try to figure out what might happen if this is taken. So for example, if you promote, say, stop using plastics, for example, for packaging, that means that your entire supply chain of food is now out of the window, because it's based on the shelf life of the products which are packaged in specific environment with the barrier properties of the polymers. You can't replace it overnight. That's not possible. That's the technology and the entire supply chain which has been developing for decades. So you tweak one thing, and then you completely destroy the entire supply chain. So this is, and it's probably not even the right thing to solve, because if you put the end of life of polymers in place, you actually don't have the problem. And there are many other things like this. However, there are very difficult instruments which could be used. For example, I would think that if a manufacturer is made responsible for the end of life of everything they sell, for example, if there is a regulation that everybody who sells something within a country, even though the manufacturer could be outside the country, is responsible for the end of life of their product, they would have to think very carefully about the design and the infrastructure around to do that. And that automatically will solve quite a few problems, but that's very, very difficult to do. And that potentially will stop quite a few things being made. But again, that's not easy to implement because it affects the jobs and the markets and businesses and so on. It affects so many interests which people would not be happy to lose money or stakes in businesses and so on. So this is really, really difficult path.
So basically, do you feel then that cost is a big issue? For example, if let's say that to make sure that a packaging is properly recycled the right way, that will involve a higher cost, which most likely the producer or the maker won't end up paying, but it will be the consumer. And then it's who can afford those products at the end of the day. So would you think there's a bigger divide between the north and south divide that we usually hear?
This is another problem of inequality. If you look where people adopt more sustainable practices at home, it's usually middle class. If you go and talk to people in other areas with different incomes, then it's not the same. It's not always so widespread because people have different problems and different focus, and maybe the preferences are not the same. So this is where reducing the inequality between people, between generations, between countries is critically important for sustainability, without of course creating other problems such as overconsumption and so on. So the cost basis it's a very difficult economic problem. It's like also the childcare. Who has to pay for the childcare in UK? Childcare is ridiculously expensive, and there are consequences from this for people in terms of jobs and opportunities for women and so on. Whereas in Scandinavia, in some countries, this is taken care of by the government at accepting that cost, but creating different societal opportunities, and of course then offsetting this cost by creating new types of possibilities and new income streams for the country. So you see that in every time we can take a knee-jerk reaction and say, yes, we're going to impose certain conditions on the sale of products and the cost will be put down to the consumer and so on. But maybe there are positive feedback somewhere and there will be other opportunities and other income streams which compensate for this. And this is how these types of adaptive systems evolve.
So do you think then that pursuing the development of machine learning and AI methods will help reducing cost in the long term?
Yes, so what already transpires is that through understanding of the patterns, through understanding of the data, we can reduce the material flows. We can much faster increase performance of materials and performance of molecules, and so reduce the material intensity. But we can also change the business models, and we can change the way how supply chains are structured, so that they are a lot more efficient. And these are this is only possible through finding the connections, establishing the links between the data and different knowledge domains, and exploiting this. And this is where human mind is not very well adapted to this, because these are highly multidimensional problems, and we very well operate with few variables, but not with hundreds of variables. That's not possible for us. Whereas algorithms are much better at those types of problems. So then we can use algorithms to help us to understand what's going on through so-called dimensionality reduction techniques and visualization of these multidimensional spaces. So this is where the AI tools and machine learning is particularly useful.
So within, what you have been using, sort of machine learning and AI methods, is that being copied, or is it being replicated rather than copied? Is it being replicated in other areas, for example, in physics?
I think it's the other way around. We are learning from other industries. Machine learning has been mostly applied in image processing and in physics and signal processing. So physics and imaging are much more ahead, and biology as well, much further ahead than chemistry and chemical engineering and application of machine learning and AI. The chemistry is different compared to other tools where machine learning is involved. In the sort of classical domains of application of ML, you have a lot of data, signals, electrical signals, or images, space images, or just images in a self-driven car from cameras. They contain a lot of information and really very, very rich data sets. Whereas in chemistry, you don't have very large data sets. Even our data sets of known molecules and known reactions, we count this in millions of records, but they're still small compared to classical machine learning data sets. So what we need to do is then work with mathematics to develop adaptations of the classical machine learning tools, and they are slightly different. So we're much closer to fundamental physics, and our machine learning tools are hybrids between physical models and statistical models, because this is how we bridge the data gap that there's not enough data. And we trying to make sure that we have the AI models which are interpretable, so that we can generalize and move between different areas of chemistry or different solutions within chemical technology. So there is some difference between how AI and machine learning is applied, but it's a very open space at the moment. There is learning across the disciplines and across the application domains of ML, which is very rapid at the moment. It started slowly, but it's now a lot faster and much more interesting, I would say.
So Alexei, thank you very much for your time today. It has been wonderful, and would really look forward to learning more about it in the future.
Thank you very much, Internet.
Well, that's all the time we had for today. Have a wonderful week and chat next week.